Hello, and welcome to the first devlog for this Voxel-based RPG game, a game I am developing using my own custom engine. This game is focused around loot, collectibles, and exploration. It is set in a fantasy RPG world and generally follows many of the tropes you might expect from that sort of game, including wizards, warriors, and monsters. It features a turn-based combat system, similar at the moment to games like Pokemon, although in future I think I might change some of it. As well as this, the player will also be able to explore certain scenes in this more traditional sort of movement pattern. The real meat of the game, however, is about exploration and finding collectibles as you go. Generally, I am designing this game around mobile interfaces, as I think this is the platform where it would fit the best, although I plan to have it size up differently on platforms like desktop. The idea for the game came originally from a simple text-based game I used to make whenever I was learning a new programming language. This game would involve a set of options such as explore, shop, inventory, and so on. When the player pressed explore, they would be presented with a screen which would gradually tick up to 100% before being shown what they had actually found. This would be something like a combat encounter, an item, a location, or something similar. The game was based entirely around text and was really just there to help me learn the basics of the language. But the thing was, I did quite enjoy playing through this game as well. Working on my game engine, the AV engine, I eventually thought it might be interesting to try and rewrite that game. I wanted to test my dialogue system at the time, and felt I would be able to recreate the text-based game using nothing but that dialogue system quite easily. That would allow me to test how the dialogue system actually worked, as well as improve its features. I didn't think I'd produce any real game with it. However, when testing this, I came to a conclusion. Maybe I could make something interesting with just this. I considered things like adding a few meshes to show what the player was fighting, or some animations to the text, but still, I wondered if it was interesting enough. Gradually, the idea grew in my head that I could keep the bones of the original game, while also mixing it with something new. The idea properly solidified for me when I considered that I could turn the exploration section into a sort of item collectathon. The pitch. I would like to distill all parts of an RPG game that I feel makes them interesting. This includes combat, quests, interesting stories, and of course, loot. The plan is to turn the exploration screen into a sort of slot machine. The player begins their exploration and gradually the percentage completes, just like how it did in the old game. The player is presented with their spoils or encounters as time progresses and has to manage their health and other stats. Found items can be either scrapped for cash or added to the inventory, and there will be mechanics like scrapping on the spot will yield less than if you were to take the items to the town and sell them. As well as this, the player can also find locations. Originally I had planned to keep this to just text content, but recently decided to include a proper overworld to explore these locations. There will be options to explore a number of different biomes to have variety. For instance, the player will be able to find different items in the desert than in the forest. The things the player finds are randomized, including places found, encounters, and so on. The player does not necessarily find things in any particular order either, as I think it would be interesting to mix things up. The idea is to distill one of my favourite bits of this sort of game, the exploration and discovery, into a single mechanic that will fit well on a mobile device. On that thought for a moment, you might shudder when I mention that this is predominantly a mobile game, especially as I've already mentioned the phrase slot machine. Well, that's just because I really enjoy this sort of game, especially while on the go, as you don't have to pay too much attention to it. I do think the grind can be quite fun. The problem I have is that most games ruin it with microtransactions. I wanted to make the sort of mobile game that I was sad I couldn't play anymore, and have decided as a result that I will not include microtransactions, or at least consumable ones. What I mean by that is, I do need to make some money from this game, but the line I have decided to draw is that I will make it so that the player can unlock extra biomes, or something like that, but really that's for the future to decide. What I can promise is that there will be no large buckets of gems or anything like that. I'm not sure I want to have the player paywalled instantly, just because that's not really how the marketplace works these days. However, the rest of the game will be playable with no catch, meaning it'll be a fun collectathon without the guilt trip of the modern mobile marketplace. The final part of the pitch is that I want to have an actual decent story in this game. I do think this will be quite hard, as things are so random, but I do think it can be done. I want there to be dialogue between characters, which is partly why I added the scene exploration, collectibles in the overworld, dialogue choices, and so on. I expect the quests will sort of pay out like RuneScape, and that the player has a quest diary and given instructions on how to complete them. I think that will be the two parts of the game. On one hand, you have the more grindy part, and the other part involves exploration, dialogue, cutscenes, and so on. I would like the story to be the bit that makes the player want to finish the game, but the fun exploration mechanics be the bit that keeps the player coming back. So that was the idea. I decided first and foremost that I should give myself a month to make a prototype of this. At this point, I was still working full time, meaning my free time to actually work on the game was limited. However, I really loved the project, so it wasn't that hard to find the energy. My first steps were to write the initial dialogue screen, including the initial exploration screen. In Squirrel, I built a scene manager which would be in charge of what was on the screen at any one time. I could have different screens active at once, all ordered accordingly, and each was ultimately just a Calibri window. I also designed in the concept of transitions, although did not implement them at that point. I added a a tray to the exploration screen to contain your spoils, as well as an early screen to show that the player had encountered something. A few days later, with the skeleton of things appearing, I decided to try it on mobile. Remember, my engine supports mobile out of the box. Well, turns out I had written my code in a way that turns out different screen sizes would be a problem. A few sizes later, and things were looking good on both mobile and desktop. I now wanted to make it so the player could collect their items. Ultimately, I wanted there to be gesture support on mobile to do things like scrap or claim items. However, this presented a problem for mouse and keyboard or controller users, as that gesture would not be available to them. What I instead decided to do was now focus on the bit of the interface that they would all use, the item information screen. Either with a long press or something similar on desktop, all platforms would have access to this feature, so I decided to just implement it immediately. This screen would present actions to the player as well as item descriptions and stats. With this, the player could finally collect their items. I will note at this point that while I was doing all of this, I was also making improvements to my engine. I did not have amazing support for what Calibri GUI offered in sizer support, so I had to add a few of these features into the engine as I went. Now, the player could collect items, but they could not actually keep them anywhere, because there was no inventory. So I added one, and later, the ability to click the items and get taken to the item info screen. Now, I wanted to add initial support for places. I had originally envisaged that this would involve just some dialogue to let the player know where they are and what's going on. I eventually planned to walk this back, as it didn't work as well as I thought it would, but it was still pretty interesting. I had to do some rewriting of the code at this point to make a distinction between items and places. This allowed me to colour the buttons based on the item you had found. I plan to do lots more of this in the future. Now, the exploration was officially good enough, and I thought I'd start on the next system, combat. Early combat was pretty rough and generally involved lots of text on screen. The player had a basic attack as well as 4 special attacks. The idea I had was that there would be endless basic attacks, but special attacks would deal more damage but cost energy, similar to something like Pokemon. I also added the ability to specify which enemy to attack. I also worked through the code mostly from a design perspective here, focused on trying to make the systems robust and generally code clean. One improvement I made to the GUI at this point was make sure that each GUI component was properly decoupled. I did this by using a bus object, which pretty much just shoveled events around the place. Each GUI widget would be provided with this bus in its constructor and would register itself and would generate or respond to events. This in theory meant I could create things like automated tests way easier, as well as generally maintain clean code. Improving what I had, I made enemies able to attack the player, and hooked everything up with exploration encounters. At this point, I went through the code and fixed some issues I had with it. This included proper support to go back a screen, as previously I had hard-coded the destinations, which meant that some screens like inventory went back to the wrong place, separated many related classes into their own files, and fixed some code. Next, I added player item equipping, although don't look too hard at the interface as I'll fix it later. I added spoils when an enemy is defeated, and subsequently had to rethink my approach to items. It was at this point I had the skeleton of the game, but it looked incredibly boring. I wanted to spice it up a bit, so began trying to improve some of my user interface, notably the health bars. You're boring, mate! Just this small change made the game look way better, and I was really happy with how it looked. I then started working on a pop-up system to try and give feedback to users. However, it was around this time I decided the game needed some models. I had planned to incorporate voxel models into the game, and generally go with the voxel art style. This was partly because I thought it was a generally good look, and also because it was easy to add. However, my game engine is based around Ogre 3D, which meant I would have to find a way to get the models into a form that could understand. As part of my engine tools, I wrote a Dockerized export tool, which could convert Blender files into Ogre's .mesh format. The idea was I'd version the project files with something like git lfs, meaning I would never lose any data to an export, and it would be simple to re-export stuff, as I just had to run the export script. However, here I would not be using Blender, as I was dealing with voxels, and there are better tools available to do that. I decided to go with the tool Voxel, as it was open source and generally quite compact. I set about making some tests with it. Turns out it can export directly to .obj formats. Even better than that, turns out it can export a .gox file to .obj entirely through the command line. Great! So in theory, my asset pipeline tool could just export to .obj, which is a human readable format. I'd then have a script to export to Ogre's .mesh.xml format. Again, human readable, before using Ogre's mesh tool to convert it to a .mesh file, ready for use in Ogre. In theory, I could automate this entire process. However, some questions still remained. Firstly, how would voxel colors make it into the game? Each voxel can have an individual color, remember. Really, there's two approaches to this. Either store the colours as vertex data, which is what the .obj file format does, or wrap them as UVs and then include a palette with your game as a texture. I eventually decided to go with UVs and textures, as colour data would require an RGB, whereas UVs were just 2 texture values. And secondly, swapping the palette is really easy if using UVs, with no modifications to the meshes required. This meant that every model in the game could also, in theory, use the same material, which would be great for performance. Now, I needed to get the models from .obj to ogre's.mesh format. A problem I was presented with, however, was ogre's mesh XML needed to know the mesh UVs, whereas the .obj file format provided only color values. So I wrote a Python script to convert .obj to ogre mesh XML, while also converting the UV values, and anything else I needed. At this point, I could manually step through the pipeline to go from .gox to ogre.mesh. My final remaining question was, how do I fit this into my current pipeline? I wanted to keep the pipeline as generic as possible, and including Voxel support in a monolithic approach would just be a bit janky in my opinion, as not everyone needed it. I would have had to upload my base Docker image with an extra few megabytes of Voxel binaries, as well as generic code clutter. So I had to think, eventually arriving at the conclusion that I could try dynamically loading Python scripts based on the asset file extension. Previously I had just hard-coded what to do in case of .blend, .svg and so on, but this could be improved. Instead, I separated each asset type into asset modules, each containing a procedure for how to export. Each module registered a file ending type and then contained some Python logic to export that. The code would load the officially supported modules by default, and then the user could dynamically load the ones they needed with a command line parameter. Conversely, in Docker world, you're able to base containers off other containers. So in my game's repo, I created a Docker file which was based off my native asset builder container and included support for all of Voxel's dependencies, including compiling the Voxel source code itself into a binary for the container. Now, just moving a single file into place, I can modify my run script based off of my template project to request the asset tool become aware of the Voxel asset module. Finally, after quite a bit of planning, I could go from a .gox file to an ogre mesh, while only having to run a single script. That optimization was probably one of the most exciting things I did during the entire project. The thing is, that sort of optimization will save you tons of time in the long run, so it's worth doing. I'd just like to point out that there are loads more optimizations I can do to this. Firstly, the meshes are not optimized, meaning they're very low performance and memory intensive. The solution to this is to use something called greedy meshing. Secondly, I can really reduce the file size if I reduce the data required per vertice. Voxels are simple, there are only a few potential normals and only a few potential colors. I can condense both these values down to a single byte, most likely rather than the 20 or so that currently exist at the moment. Secondly, voxels conform to a grid, meaning I have no need for floats in positions as I'm doing right now. I could just specify those positions as ints and then scale them up in the vertex shader. For small meshes that never go over say 16 by 16, which will most likely be a lot of them, I can fit them into only the space of a few bytes. So really I could see dramatic reductions in model sizes and VRAM uses if I follow this approach. However, I think I'll save this for the future. The problem I have here is it's a technical piece of work. In order to get that to work with Ogre, I would need to start to modify the physically based shader HLMS, as well as to produce my own custom mesh format. The HLMS stands for the High Level Material System. It's essentially Ogre's approach of generating shaders dynamically depending on what the model actually requires. My engine does not currently support any of that, and I'd want to make sure it's done nicely. I do feel like I'll be coming back to this piece of work eventually, but for now, I'll leave it with what I have. Now, with the ability to easily export meshes to Ogre, I set about integrating them into the game. I added a render window to show the entity currently being fought. I built a compositor manager to deal with the life cycle of these windows, as well as the content shown in them. This again presented me with the need to rewrite some code, as I needed to make sure screens were properly notified of their imminent destruction. Quickly though, I had some hopping enemies and a death animation. I also decided to add a view of the player to the screen, however this also presented me with a problem. My engine only supports a single Ogre scene at a time, meaning I had to use some interesting render queue techniques to make it so there was no duplication on the screens. This all worked quite well however, it just involved me having to change some code. I felt my prototype was approaching completion for the goals I had initially set for the end of the year. One thing I wanted to try however was an actual interactable world scene, rather than just the text approach I had used before. I created a small town scene in Voxel and tested it out in the engine. Oof. Maybe I'll be rethinking that Voxel approach quite soon. In all seriousness, it's way more likely to be my Python script that's savaging the meshes, but the fact it takes so noticeably long to export large scenes is not a good sign. I did get the movement around the scene working though, and later added some enemies to chase the player. When the player collides with them, they will be presented with a combat screen, which I think is quite nice. And really, that's as far as I got before the start of the new year. I had a break to edit the previous video, which you should totally watch, but that's the state of the game at the moment. My thoughts on it as a prototype is this: there are some good and some bad. I wouldn't say it's reached the point where it's fun yet, but I can see how with a few adjustments it will be quite soon. Really, my next steps with this game will be to try and productionize it. I want to try and fix all the remaining issues with the GUI, including pixely font on mobile, button skins being rubbish, and generally start juicing things. Ultimately, I want to try and make the exploration screen as interesting as possible. This includes fun animations, flashing, maybe some animations when you get coins, and so on. I think the sooner I realise what's most fun about this game, the sooner I can start producing assets to put some meat on the bones I've produced so far. One of the things that did not get mentioned previously was that I've also started trying to write some lore for the world. I'm using the method I normally use for this sort of thing, which is MediaWiki. In case you don't know what that is, it's essentially just Wikipedia, as the code for it is open sourced as MediaWiki. You can just host it from a Docker container and have it write its database as an SQLite file. It's a really fantastic tool for keeping complex lore in order, and I definitely recommend trying it out if you like this stuff. Hello again. I think I'm just going to do a sort of short talking section at the end of each video, just because I often find that I'll record it and record all the voices before and then find out there's some extra stuff I need to add. So that's what this is. So that was a recap of a month and a bit's work. It was a very fun project to work on, so I'm looking forward to continuing it. I'd just like to talk through some problems I have in the system at the moment. Number one is that the user interface code is not as stable as I would like it to be. It's got problems with widget lifecycle. Well, it's been dumping cores for quite a long time when you shut the project down, which is never a good sign, but it also wasn't critical enough that I felt like I needed to actually fix it. My current approach does a lot of complete teardowns of the user interface when you go to something like the item info screen, and that can cause seg faults, it seems. So yeah, I need to fix that. Secondly is that I predominantly do my development on the Mac. So this is a MacBook, but I recently updated it to macOS Ventura and found that suddenly everything behaves differently. Originally there was a bug where the screen was flashing weirdly. It was very strange. I know the reason why. It's because it's something to do with VSync. It used to be that previously my frames were capped at 120 for the MacBook display. It seems they're running unlimited now. I know that Ventura had an update to a new version of Metal, so I think it has something to do with that. But suffice to say, it makes it a bit annoying to develop things on the Mac. It's been like that for about a month now, and I think my plan was that I would just tackle it sooner or later. I do have a slight workaround for it, but that means that the screen flashes every now and again, and I don't quite know why it does that. Another question that I feel like I'm almost certainly going to get is, what about Android support? Currently it works essentially flawlessly on iOS. But Android-wise, the engine does actually run on Android, you'd be pleased to know. But that was a sort of beta test version. I got quite far into actually porting it to Android. Luckily, with Vulkan support in Ogre, it wasn't too bad. The problem I ran into was that the way that Android deals with resources is different from essentially every other platform I've developed for before. Android uses like a sort of bundle approach to resources, so everything is stored in the APK, whereas everything else is essentially just standard file systems. I was able to get a bit of it working, but I had to use a bit of a hack where I put it on the phone's actual file storage, because that's an actual file system, right? So that worked. Essentially what happened after that was that this phone actually belonged to work, and when I left I had to give it back. So I currently do not own an Android phone. So that's a problem if you're doing Android development. So I think at some point I'll have to find myself an Android phone. I'd also like to say sorry for the acoustics in the last video. I realised that the acoustics in this room are actually awful, and I get way better acoustics if I record out in the hallway. Of course it's difficult when doing a video like this because I want to be at my desk. I'm figuring out how to do stuff, so bear with me. Another thing I would like to say is that while I work out what I actually want to do on this channel, you might see a bit of sort of change in style over the next few weeks. Essentially I need to figure out what works and what doesn't. Every video I've made up until this point has been a sort of recount of what happened previously, but looking into the future I want to be logging as I develop stuff. So I think there's the question of how the videos are actually styled when I do that. So there's a few different ideas I'm wondering. I'm either just do a recap right at the end or do like a sort of, like day in the life type things. So I think I'm going to try one or two at some point in the next few weeks and see what I feel like works best for this channel. It's been good so far with the videos I've made. I'm quite pleased with how they turned out. The issue is that they take quite a long time to actually make. The first video took about 14 days in total. The thing is, I'm here to make a game, not necessarily videos, although videos are another part of it, so I sort of have to balance the two. And I think I want to figure out how to maintain the quality while also being as efficient as I possibly can. So essentially I just want to make an interesting development story. Yeah, that's the idea. I'd just like to give you a quick overview of what the story for this game is actually about, because I haven't mentioned this at this point. So the story is quite interesting actually, and this is based off an idea I came up with a little while ago. So it's set in a sort of standard RPG setting, you know, you've got kings, queens, castles, all that sort of thing. But what ends up happening is that an alien spaceship actually comes and crashes into this fancy kingdom. And of course the people of the kingdom don't necessarily know what that ship actually is. Of course, you being the player will understand it's going to be standard sci-fi spaceship. But it turns out that this ship was actually a cargo ship that had been infested by these sort of mind-controlling face-hugger aliens. And they gradually show up in the planet and start sort of spreading around and trying to take control of people and all this sort of thing. So it's quite a cool idea, I think. I'm not sure if it's been done before, but I did come up with it myself. This was originally the idea for the RPG game I was developing before, so it didn't end up being the premise for that because it got too complicated. But no, I think it's going to be a really cool premise for a story, because I think I'll be able to contrast traditional RPG themes with a sort of sci-fi setting. So the combination of the two is something I'm quite interested in. As mentioned at the start of the video, it does actually not have a name yet. I came up with a few names. It's very difficult to come up with names for things, I think. My original name for it was Blight Quest. Blight as in sickness. I think I'm just going to kind of keep thinking of potential names, and as soon as I come up with something that seems like it might fit, then I'll just I'll go with that. But feel free to suggest any name you might think down in the comments, but otherwise I'll keep having a think. Originally I was not going to ship a video about the game until I actually knew what it was going to be called, but you know, whatever. Felt like I needed to get on with it. The final thing I would like to say before I leave is thank you for the support on the previous video. It was very nice to see. It's the sort of thing that I'd planned this all out for a while, and then I posted the video and it was like sat dead on 4 views for the first 2-3 days or so. I ended up having to share it around a few places. I wanted to see if the algorithm would sort of get it going organically, but I guess it didn't. But I did that and it seemed like it snowballed, and it's just been fantastic. I've had lots of very nice things said on the comments, and just the general rate in which I've gained subscribers is very nice, so thank you for that. I hope you're all interested on the premise of what I'm actually working on. I think we're just going to have to see how it goes as time moves on. So, I don't actually have an official outro, so I guess subscribe!